Good afternoon. I'm Jen O'Brien with Hawks Learning. Today is the second and final day of the Innovative Educator Summit. Welcome to those of you joining us for the first time. And for those of you who are returning from yesterday, I hope you found the sessions enjoyable and informative, and we're glad to have you back. I'd like to take a moment again to express our sincere appreciation for all of the speakers presenting today. Thank you for joining us to share your expertise and experience. We truly appreciate your participation in this event. As a reminder, all sessions will be recorded, and we will send out information on how to access the recordings after the conference. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's keynote speaker, Arjun Bakshi. Arjun is an executive coach to Silicon Valley tech leaders, a professor of communication and leadership at San Jose State's MBA program, and an award-winning public speaker. He recently authored Communication Means Talking Together. Informed by his lifelong experiences as part of family-owned businesses, he is passionate about helping students and entrepreneurs alike find their voice. Arjun, thank you for joining us today, and I will let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Hope everyone can hear me very well. And a good afternoon to everyone out there in this conference. Thank you for having me. So folks, as was being shared by Jennifer and her team, I'm a consultant and a professor out here in California, and it is my pleasure to share communication and leadership skills with everyone that I work with, both students and executives. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that, but specifically how communication can be used not just for work, but life and learning as a whole to create positive outcomes for ourselves. Some simple things we can learn, very actionable things we can learn that we can put to use today itself if you're ready. And perhaps you'll see how communication really does mean talking together. So a little bit more about myself. Jennifer gave a wonderful background. So the one thing I wanted to share, other than the nuts and bolts of what I do and who I am, is what makes me tick. And I think what the simplest way I can explain that is I am fascinated by how people interact one-on-one, as part of organizations, as part of work, as part of families. And it has been my life's work to understand how to create alignment, how to create understanding between individuals as well as groups of people. So that has brought me to be an academic as well as a business professional and an author. So hope to share some of those ideas with you here today. So let's start with a question really, and I'm monitoring the chat box so you can feel free to throw in some responses if you so choose. What is a big problem in your work life right now? Some suggestions up here on the screen. Do you feel that despite your efforts, you don't get due credit for what you're doing? Do you feel, as a result of that, do you feel you're not getting promoted, not getting noticed, not getting a good job? Maybe you're looking for a job or looking for a new kind of job, and you're not really getting that foot in the door. The interviews aren't really going as well as you would like them to be. And ultimately, do you feel as if people don't give you the kind of respect that you need and quite frankly deserve? Some of that could be due to how we're communicating with other people, and that's part of what we're going to learn here today. So if we think about it, a lot of this breaks down into three things. We're trying to be credible, believable, respectable, trustworthy in front of all the people that we speak with. And we are always trying to make sure that whatever ideas we have, and I'm sure all those gathered here today, education professionals and other kinds of professionals, you all have fascinating ideas, solving problems, creating innovations and helping people. But are they being impactful the way you'd like them to be? Part of that is making sure that those that are listening to us and speaking with us are engaged with us. Let's talk today about we can add to our credibility, add to our impact, and add to our engagement. So before we get too far into things, the key word, the big word of the day, communication. What does that even mean to you? Think for a moment, pause for a moment, If you have something to write down your ideas. What does communication mean to you? I'll give you a very basic definition here that is collated from a lot of academic study over the years. It's all ongoing phenomena. It's all the messages, written messages, spoken messages, nonverbal messages between sentient beings through a variety of media. These days, there's no end to the ways we can share information with each other, as you know. And of course, the goal of all communication, you may see that the root word of communication and the root word of community are shared, because the sense is that we use connection and learning and talking and thinking to stay in touch with each other. So when it's about creating groups, it's about creating community, and it's about creating the rules and the culture of that community. A simpler way of thinking about communication is my own definition, which is simply communication means talking together. But let's build upon that. Communication is, if we add one more layer to it, let's think about persuasive communication. Persuasion, if you think about it, I'll give a quick sidebar definition here. Persuasion means I'm trying to affect the attitudes, thoughts, behaviors, and other kinds of thinking in the other person or the other group that I'm speaking with, right? So communication is me working with the group to affect their thoughts, changes, and outcomes, and actions perhaps, right? So what are some goals for this talk here today? How we can use persuasive communication to increase our credibility, the impact of our ideas, and the engagement with our audience. Let's start with the first one. How can we talk about maximizing credibility? So we'll go right back to the basics. All of communication, as we learned here today, comes from the Greek study of rhetoric. And of course, there is reflections of this in many other cultures around the world. So here being where we are, we're looking to the three Greek words here on the screen today. Some of you may be familiar. You may have taught this in some of your classes if you have that background. Ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, right? This is your background. This is your credentials. Pathos, this is what you're trying to do regarding your vision, your emotional connection to others. You're trying to connect, applying it to the workplace, to your team, and perhaps if you're a leader, you're trying to share a vision and optimism for the future. Again, this is two parts, and here is a third piece, which is logos. Logos here is regarding knowledge, proof, evidence, substantiation of our ideas. We can have the best ideas in the world, folks, but if they're not backed up by fact and evidence, and if they're not logically created or connected to each other, they won't have that impact on our audience. So let's put it all together. We want to be able to work on how people can respect us as a person, as a speaker, as a leader at work. We want to be able to have that emotional connection with those we're working with, those we're speaking to, and we have to have well-substantiated, highly logical thoughts and ideas. Very simple, right? And that's the beauty of communication. It is ultimately very simple. So think about this on a personal level. Think about your resume, if you will. Think about yourself in a business networking situation. And perhaps in the pre-COVID era, you used to do, as I did, as so many of us did, these events and conferences where we'd have people sharing business cards with each other and then saying, tell me about yourself. And we would sort of come up with this 2-minute personal introduction, trying to make it brief, precise, clear, and impactful so that the person knows a little bit about our work background, what we do for a living, perhaps what company we work for, some important award or project we're working with, and more to perhaps our resume. You're thinking about other things you've done, publications. Think about your LinkedIn profile. What is it you've put on your LinkedIn profile that you're trying to use to create a persona and get people to appreciate who you are and respect what you do? So when you go home today, think about at least one of these slides here. Are you being able to effectively and regularly communicate without coming across as egotistical? Are you able to communicate that you have achieved something? Because the one mistake in my consulting work that I find is people feel, well, my work should speak for itself. It should, but frequently you need to speak for your work as well. And you deserve that, because people need to know the story behind your success. That's actually a pretty good jumping off point to sort of the second segment, which is how can we maximize the impact of our ideas? Well, I always like to share that communication can be broken into three things. I frequently say that because it can be broken into three things in multiple different ways. But the one that I'm thinking of right now is content, structure, and delivery. So here we're talking about structure. Structure in the sense that stories are the most powerful way that you can share information with anyone. Think about the amount of times you're keen to hear a funny story or an exciting story from a friend or a loved one. There's a reason for that, because there's characters involved, there's things at stake, there's highs and lows, there's danger perhaps, and there's a surprise, right? There's some big reveal, which even though you've heard the story before, the way the person tells it, they build up this suspense, and before you know it, everything's all right, everybody's happy, and we move on with our lives, right? The idea, of course, being that the same structure, the overcoming of obstacles, putting some layers behind it, going through a journey with ourselves, our coworkers, that can be absolutely applied to our work situation. And I'll give you some ideas of how we can do that. So first, let's think about what makes a story pop, right? Why should we listen to a particular story? So there's a few language things we can do to make it more visual, because ultimately, think about it. If unless you're producing a movie or a video, you're asking people to hear the words you're saying and imagine pictures in their mind, right? So you have to tell people the size of things, right? I'm frequently in my public speaking courses, I will tell people this is called an illustrative gesture. So if I go to the zoo and I see a baby giraffe, and I'll say, the baby giraffe was this tall, right? And so that gives my audience an idea of indeed how tall the baby giraffe was. I might tell people the shape of things, like, it's a square, it's a cuboid, it's a sphere, right? You use hand gestures, you use words like sphere, cuboid, and so forth, and gives people an idea of the shape, and so on. And so you have things like color, strong adjectives. Don't just tell me you're in pain. Tell me if you're in excruciating pain. Hopefully no one's in excruciating pain. But you get the idea. Adding that little bit of emphasis and color and impact creates a memorability and a visualization that otherwise simply wouldn't help people connect to your story. So let's take a look at an example, all right? So imagine for a minute you're in a typical software company, which is the kind of companies I tend to work with. So everyone's working late, or everything's fine late on a Friday, but the analytics dashboard was a mess and it kept rebooting. Just jumped on it immediately and cleaned it up, made sure we were all fine on Monday. The project stayed perfectly on track. Thanks, Jess, you're awesome. This is something that you might say at a water cooler, metaphorically speaking, of course. The idea being that these are typical stories that we come up with off the cuff. No real preparation needed, no real major detail, no real structure, but it creates a sense of suspense, right? And there's a before, a middle, and an after, beginning, middle, and an end. So let's take this and ramp it up a little bit more. So I'll give you a slightly more powerful structure. Some of you might find this a little bit familiar, the STAR format. situation, task, action, and result. This format's been around a while, and it's been most famously, it's been used to prep people for interviews. So think back to, hopefully it wasn't too harrowing an experience, your last job interview, whichever side of the table you may have been on. And you're asking someone to reflect back on an incident or a memory from a time when they had a problem to solve, right? And how did they go about solving it? STAR method gives us a really good format to give the response to that kind of question. But also it gives simultaneously a great format for you to work with your boss and give them a work update. Let them know how things are going on whatever project you're working on. So let's sort of illustrate each piece here. And then I do have an example to give you a further illustration. Situation, as it sounds, it's setting the stage. Give us the background, give us some basic details as to what's going on, what's the context, basically, right? Then you go to task. That simply translates to the problem. What's the issue? What needs fixing? Why is it important, right? Frequently, the why is it important piece gets missed. So that's why I'm mentioning it here. The third step would be action, right? Now, this is very simply put, all the things we are going to do or have done as part of the plan to fix the problem, to overcome the challenge. And it may have other details such as the timeline, maybe different roles that different people are playing, and so forth. Finally, you have results. Again, the results could be in the past tense that we've achieved the results, or the future tense that we are working towards those results as a goal. And of course, the idea being that you're trying to show a sense of analytical problem-solving thinking, but also with the action step, you're trying to show your leadership ability, right? You're trying to show how you corralled everyone together, created a plan, put it into action, and got it done, assuming it's in the past tense. And of course, with the results, you try and make sure that you show all goals were achieved on time, under budget, per expectations, and per rules and regulations. And that creates a great sense of credibility, going back to an earlier point, in front of the leadership that you're speaking to. So now let's take a look at a full illustration of this. Fun fact, this is actually adapted from a tech company client. I've changed a few details for privacy reasons, but it is an absolutely truthful example that successfully was presented by this client. So let me walk you through it. So we start with the situation, again, the background step, right? So they're talking about how they built a data platform, the first version, but they found that there was a defect. It wasn't scalable. And you need additional data sets in order to make it scalable, right? So already you're leading into the next step, which is the task, the challenge, the problem. In order to get these additional data sets, we need to push the data from existing platforms, right? We don't need to worry about the details, but we're facing budget constraints, so we can't move ahead. That takes us to the action. So we're requesting an increase in budget, right? So that we can do all these things. And finally, assuming the budget was approved, we can have greater insights, we can synchronize efforts across different teams, and we can have a better view of our metrics. So now you get an idea, folks, that if you take what's probably what probably we're trying to get at with all that we've shared thus far, and there's a little bit more to go, is creating a format, a logical step-by-step structure, and a visualization of a situation. Moves us away from a jumbled back and forth sharing into a very clear story with a beginning, middle, and end, and in a work context, an ask, right? And so then the boss, the management, whomever you're speaking with, knows exactly what's needed and is able to hopefully get back to you with some good news and move the project forward. So now we know how to tell a story for a work context in a structured manner. But going back to one of the things I said earlier, it's about engagement, right? So delivery. What are some things we do when we are speaking? Doesn't matter if it's at work, doesn't matter if it's with friends or loved ones. What are some things we do that take away from the impact of what we're trying to do? Look at all these words for a moment. Maybe, if, kind of, sort of. Do we say these words a lot? Right? And we also say a lot of filler words like and like, right? Think about the impact of that. We are diluting the impact and the power of our own credibility. These are all what we call qualifiers. In other words, what are we communicating when we say, going back to the list again, what are we communicating when we say more than the acceptable amount of these words? We are taking away from how sure we sound, how confident we sound about the thing we're trying to say. And when we do that, other people aren't sure if we're the right person for it. If it's a job interview, maybe they'll not put us in the top of the list, right? Because they're worried that we're not ready for it. If it's a project we're in charge of, the boss may feel, are you the right person for this project? So let's think about how we can overcome this. I'll give you, excuse me, a fun, this is absolutely a true story. This actually happened a couple of weeks ago. I was on a video call back home in India, where I'm from, and my cousin was on the line and my nephew was there, and it was breakfast time in India. And so I was saying, hello, how are you folks doing? How's your week? And so my nephew was supposed to be having his oatmeal for breakfast. And so my cousin kept saying, hey, let's make up a name here. Hey, John, you haven't had your oatmeal, in this exact tone. And I kid you not, 3 times they said that, no response. He just kept playing with his toys and not eating his food. Now, imagine, I'm speaking through a tablet, right? So we're on a video call. In a deep tone, okay, I said, John, I'd like you to eat your oatmeal now, please. I put the please at the end so it doesn't sound so commanding. And I kid you not, he dropped his card right there, okay? And he looked at the screen and slowly started walking towards the bowl of oatmeal. And so I knew I needed to push a little bit more. So what I do? Okay, good job, John. I know you can do this. Let's have some oatmeal. And before you knew it, half the bowl of oatmeal was gone. True story. So what do we do here? And what can you take from this, folks? Having that deep tone and utilizing it sparingly, not all the time, is extremely powerful because it connotes authority and seriousness. What's another thing I did, which I omitted to put on the screen? Short, powerful sentences. Did you hear any qualifiers? Did I put maybe? No, I just put a please at the end because of politeness, but that much is all right. I varied my tone, right? Because I'm trying to make sure that the other person stays engaged with what I'm saying. I'm doing it right now, right? You go high and low and high and low. It's almost like talking is not too different from singing, right? If it's all monotone, people stop listening. So the idea is you're trying to pick and choose your moments to do this, of course, but time will give you an opportunity to not say a request, but rather a command. And there are situations, like with the child, where that might be warranted because you're trying to get a response. But that gets coupled with an encouraging tone, a supportive communication to follow through. The command gets the action going, but then the supportive, encouraging communication sees it through, as it did in the example I illustrated. So folks, quick chance for a recap here, and then, of course, I'm here for all of your questions. We talked today a lot about communication, how it's about community building, it's about creating meaning and understanding, it's about exchange of ideas, it's about developing your credibility as a speaker, as a person in your workplace, in your career, and in your life. It's about engaging with the other person or the group of people, making sure they're hearing you, they're interested in what you have to say, and so forth. And finally, it's about using formats like the STAR method, just as an example for today's talk, but there's so many more out there that you could use to clarify your structure, create a format, and of course, most importantly, make sure people love to hear what you have to say. So those are some thoughts, folks, and I'm very happy to have anyone stay in touch, and I'm ready now for questions. So please feel free to put them in the chat box. Happy to do that.
All right, thank you. Yes, let's take a look. We don't currently have any questions that have come in yet. Feel free at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that Q&A. So if anyone has questions, you can feel free to type them in there. We still have a few minutes left. That was really helpful hearing you go through everything today. You know, a lot of our audience are, oh, actually, we've got a couple that came in already. So can you elaborate on the third item in the first slide? Is the first question.
The third item in the first slide, is it about engagement? Is that about engagement?
Let's see. It's an anonymous attendee, so I don't have their name.
Okay. Elaborate on the third item in the first slide.
Oh, the person clarified it's the one describing roots. The slide describing roots. Maybe if you share your screen, we can take a
Let me do that again. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the person can clarify a little more.
Oh, this one. Okay. Yeah. So the third item here, how engaged are when listening to us? So that's a great question. So which we were talking about, just some examples of figuring out, first of all, are our audience members engaged or not? So the simple thing is to always give the audience a lot of questions to ponder, right? In a large group like this, we're not always able to make it so interactive. But in a large group, what we can always do is give a lot of questions. And what we want people to do is identify with the challenges that are being presented. And frequently, the best way to do that is to frame your content in the form of problems and solutions, problems requiring solutions. So those are some quick general thoughts on that. I'm happy to give a more specific answer. To June Charles's question, can we have access to your PowerPoint apps? I have no issue with that. I have shared it with the organizers, and I'm more than happy to have them forward it to the attendees. Another question on there, when do you know when to add your thoughts and opinions in a meeting? That's a great question. Let's put it this way. Well, obviously, if your name is called, or if your realm of work, let's say your team, your department, the project you're working on is brought up, you have the right of response there. That's as clear as gets. Let's say none of those things happen. You're not specifically called upon, and nothing that you're working on is specifically mentioned or on the agenda. Perhaps you have a question. But I think if you're trying to make your mark, and everyone should always be trying to make your mark, unless you're in the C-suite, take it from me. Unless you're in the C-suite, you're always trying to make your mark, or you should be. Think about a lull in the audience, in the discussion, I should say, when you count, and you mentally count to 5, maybe 7 if you're really extra polite. And then you can put in a thought or an opinion. So just wait, count to 5 or 7 in your mind. And if no one's saying very much, go right ahead. But generally speaking, if you have a polite way of asking, hey, so-and-so, can you elaborate more on what you said? I was curious because blah, 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 and you insert your opinion into that. So that way it's not combative, you're not criticizing what they're doing, but you're able to illustrate that you're thinking about what's being said and you're fascinated with a further conversation. Hope that helps that question. Another question on there is, what communication techniques or styles are most important to keep in mind for a job interview? It's a great point. So with job interviews, I would say STAR method, what we went over, absolutely knockout. It's important. You want to think about, I'll teach you a quick technique. It's called mirroring. So mirroring means that however the other person is sort of behaving non-verbally, you kind of emulate that. So if they're leaning forward on their desk, you kind of lean forward too. If they're leaning back into their chair, you kind of do the same, right? So that I would highly recommend, especially for interviewing, because you're trying to emulate and show that you are similar to the other person, therefore you are fit for the job. So that's one quick thing I can teach you regarding interviews. One of the earlier questions was, what are some of the most common communication mistakes you see recent college grads make? It's a great one. I would say it's these qualifiers. So if I think I'm still sharing my screen, putting these an excessive amount of qualifiers, right, and filler words like and like, really basically rooted in second guessing ourselves. I think that's why I really wanted to include this in today's talk, is please do not second guess yourself. You have some knowledge. That being said, definitely think about what you're going to say, maybe write it down, maybe practice it if you have that opportunity, right? If you're doubtful about saying something, rather than say maybe, kind of, I hope, these kind of terms to dilute the point and make it less enjoyable, ask it as a question. So short, few words, short sentences, but as a question. That then it's less threatening, it's less direct, and it's less imposing on oneself if you're not sure about it. But definitely, I would say a common mistake is these qualifier words. This is a very good question. Is the STAR method for engaging listeners? Absolutely. It's a structural method, right? And you cannot engage your audience without memory, right? Communication is nothing without memory. If people can't remember what you said, what's the point, right? So using methods like STAR helps people mentally segment your thoughts and comments and ideas in a format that can be repeated, recalled, and hopefully put into action if you've done it very well. Another question up here is, how does one avoid spoken ideas from being stolen by another when he repeats your idea with just using one word change? Excellent point. So the first thing to do is make sure when you say your idea, you say it loudly, right? With that deep tone, like I was talking about a moment ago. You do not use these qualifier words, and you demand a response. You don't let people change the topic, and then 5 minutes later, somebody else says the same thing. So if you want to be protective about your ideas, use it in a deep, direct tone. Don't use qualifiers, and don't let people ignore it. One other thing is to, in the days of these days where we have Zoom, write down your ideas. So put it in the chat where it's right next to your name. That's one other way you can guard a few of these things. Email, of course, is another one. One more question here. How do you address a case when you're making a presentation to executives and they are working on their phone? Yes, big problem. Okay, how do we handle that? Let's put it this way. The best way you can do that, if at all this is within your realm of possibility, is to call upon them with questions. I always enjoy doing that. What do you think? And they might fumble. You only need to call them up once, only once. and everybody's a little bit more on alert. So definitely try and make sure to call one person out just one time. That usually does the trick.
Great. I think that's all we have for questions here. We do have another minute or two. Okay, great. Someone's come in with a question.
And I think this is a follow-up from the previous question, is waiting for the person to finish the texting okay? Well, it's like we're making a judgment call, right? Do we want to be in command of the room? And do we want to be polite? Do we want to find a middle ground in the middle? I would say if you're trying to establish authority in the room, once you want to jump ahead on this and make that one text the last text. How's that? Make that the only text they send. And if you have the authority to do this, and I have done this in the past, that if you have to take a phone call, feel free to step outside for a moment, and the rest of us will continue with the workshop. I've said that before, and people have very much honored it. So it's up to you. Depends on the amount of authority you have endowed onto you in the room. Feel free to make a request like that, because remember, ultimately, so many things go unsaid that they go unaddressed. But if it's said, it gets addressed. So feel free to establish your own authority, because if you respect what you're doing and if you respect yourself, well, believe it or not, people will respect you in return.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. See, one more minute in case anyone has a question they wanted to get in there. Right, I think we're good to go. Thank you so much, Arjun. That was incredibly informative. Looks like we've got someone coming in and saying that as well. Very helpful. Appreciate you presenting today.
Thank you so much, everyone.